For James Carter, buying a house in Oak Ridge Estates felt like the culmination of years of hard work. As a corporate attorney, he had spent countless late nights and early mornings grinding away to afford the perfect home. And this was it. A beautiful two-story house with a manicured lawn, nestled in a quiet, picturesque neighborhood. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes in the cul-de-sac, where friendly waves from neighbors were the norm, and where everything seemed peaceful. Or so he thought. From the moment he moved in, there was an unshakable presence looming over the neighborhood. The HOA. At first it seemed like a harmless organization meant to maintain order. The welcome letter had been friendly enough, with a list of community rules that, at a glance, appeared reasonable. But it didn't take long for James to realize that this wasn't just any HOA. It was a dictatorship, ruled by Martha Kensington, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. The first warning came just a week after James settled in. A crisp white envelope was taped to his door. A violation notice. Confused, he opened it. Your lawn does not meet HOA standards. Immediate correction required. James frowned. His lawn was perfectly trimmed, greener than half the houses on the street. He brushed it off as a mistake, assuming some overzealous HOA member had made an error. He sent a polite email asking for clarification. The response was swift and condescending. Failure to comply will result in a daily fine. HOA regulations are not up for debate. That was the moment James realized this wasn't just about rules. It was about power. At first he tried to play along. He had no intention of making waves. He hired a landscaper to ensure his lawn was pristine. A few days passed without issue. Then another notice arrived. This time it was about the color of his mailbox. Unapproved shade of black. Must be HOA standard charcoal gray. James let out a disbelieving laugh. Charcoal gray? Were they serious? But once again he complied, painting over the barely distinguishable difference. He hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The letters kept coming. One about his trash cans being placed 2 inches outside the designated area. Another about the unauthorized welcome mat at his doorstep. The final straw? A violation notice for parking his car in his own driveway. James stood outside that evening, staring at the neatly printed letter, a slow anger simmering in his chest. Something wasn't right. This wasn't about community standards. This was targeted harassment, and James Carter wasn't the kind of man to back down. Hey, real quick. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. James had dealt with unreasonable people before, negotiating stubborn contracts, handling corporate disputes, but nothing prepared him for the relentless pettiness of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. If the first few notices were an inconvenience, the next wave felt like a full-blown siege. At first, he chalked it up to bad luck. Maybe the HOA was just extra strict, holding everyone to impossible standards. But after speaking with a few neighbors, he started seeing a pattern. No one else was getting fined like he was. The next violation notice arrived just 3 days after the driveway incident. Non-compliant garden plants detected. Unauthorized flora must be removed immediately. James stared at the notice, then at the small row of lavender he had planted along the walkway. Lavender? He pulled up the HOA's landscaping rules. There was no mention of banned plants. Annoyed but not wanting trouble, he left it alone. A week later, another notice. Failure to remove unauthorized flora has resulted in a $100 fine. Additional non-compliance will lead to further action. James felt the slow burn of frustration turn into full-fledged anger. They were making things up. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting to get some answers. The meeting was held in the community center, a pristine, overly decorated clubhouse that James suspected was funded by all the ridiculous fines. At the head of the room sat Martha Kensington, the HOA president, flanked by a small board of equally smug-looking members. Martha was the epitome of someone who had never been told no. She sat with perfect posture, her graying blonde bob not a strand out of place, her manicured nails tapping impatiently as James took a seat. "Ah, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I understand you've had some issues with our regulations." James forced a smile. "More, like concerns. I've read through the HOA bylaws. Nowhere does it say lavender is banned." Martha gave a slow, patronizing nod. "Well, some rules are subject to board discretion. Lavender attracts bees, and some of our residents have allergies. We must think of the community, not just ourselves." James clenched his jaw. "So you just make up rules as you go?" Her smile tightened. "We enforce what's best for Oak Ridge Estates. And if I may be frank, homeowners who fail to cooperate tend to find themselves uncomfortable here." There it was. The veiled threat. James glanced around the room, noting how the other board members smirked, their silence a form of complicity. "It wasn't about rules. It was about control. You know," he said, leaning forward, "I get the feeling you just don't like me." Martha chuckled softly. "Oh, Mr. Carter, it's nothing personal. We just prefer residents who fit in." The harassment ramped up after that meeting. James started receiving multiple violation notices a week. The color of his front door was too glossy. His security camera was not HOA approved. Even his porch light was suddenly an issue. Then came the real kicker, a $500 fine for excessive noise. James lived alone. He didn't host parties. He didn't even play music loudly. When he demanded evidence, the HOA claimed multiple complaints had been filed. No names, no specifics, just more fabricated nonsense. When he refused to pay, they tacked on late fees and sent a letter stating that continued non-payment could result in a lien on the property. That's when James realized they weren't just harassing him. They were trying to force him out. He spent the next week knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors. A few sympathized, but were too scared to speak out. Others, mostly retirees and long-term residents, were loyal to Martha, believing the HOA kept things in order. But then James found Tom and Lisa Monroe, a young couple who had lived in the neighborhood for 2 years. "They did the same thing to us when we moved in," Lisa admitted in a hushed voice. "We got fined for everything. Mailbox color, lawn height, even our holiday decorations." Tom nodded. "We fought it at first, but then they threatened to sue us. We caved. It wasn't worth the stress." James could see the exhaustion in their eyes. This was a pattern. Martha and her board bullied homeowners until they either complied or left. But James wasn't like the others. He was a lawyer, and if they wanted a fight, he was more than ready to give them one. James had known the HOA would escalate their harassment, but even he was shocked by the sheer audacity of their next move. It started with yet another envelope taped to his door. Thicker, this time. Official-looking. He tore it open and skimmed the first few lines. His stomach twisted. Notice of violation and initiation of property lien proceedings. The letter accused him of multiple and continuous infractions, unauthorized landscaping, failure to comply with aesthetic guidelines, parking violations, and, absurdly, disturbing neighborhood harmony. The real kicker? The HOA had compiled over $8,000 in fines against him. If he didn't pay within 30 days, they would place a lien on his house and initiate foreclosure proceedings. James clenched the letter in his fist. This wasn't about rules. It was about getting rid of him. That evening he sat on his porch, scanning the quiet street. The neighborhood was perfect on the surface. Pristine sidewalks, neatly trimmed lawns, peaceful silence. But beneath that perfect exterior, Martha Kensington ruled with an iron fist. A voice broke his thoughts. "You okay?" James looked up to see Tom Monroe, his neighbor who had been bullied into submission by the HOA. "Got this today," James muttered, handing over the letter. Tom's expression darkened as he read it. "They did the same thing to a guy down the block last year. He fought for months, but eventually he just gave up and sold his house. That's what they want." James exhaled slowly. That had been the plan all along: bury him in fines, make his life unbearable, and force him to sell. He had two choices: pack up and leave like the others, or fight back. And James Carter wasn't the kind of man to roll over. He straightened. "I'm not going anywhere." Tom hesitated. Then, for the first time since they met, his face showed something new. Hope. Then, "Let's take them down." James had handled high-stakes corporate disputes before, but this was personal. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA had declared war on him, and if they thought he would back down, they had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. That night, James sat up in his home office with a fresh cup of coffee and his laptop. If he was going to fight back, he needed evidence. He started with the HOA bylaws, the same ones Martha and her board loved to weaponize. He combed through every page, every clause, every fine print. It didn't take long before he found something interesting. There was no official clause about mailbox colors, lavender plants, or even driveway parking restrictions. Yet, he had been fined for all three. Then, something even bigger caught his eye. The HOA's authority to impose fines was strictly limited. Law. They could only fine a homeowner after providing written warnings and an opportunity to appeal in a hearing. James had never been given a hearing. He smirked. That was illegal. James knew HOAs were required to keep financial records, and those records had to be made available to homeowners upon request. The next morning, he sent a formal email to the HOA board, requesting access to their budget reports. Unsurprisingly, he received a stonewalling response. Financial records are only available for review during designated HOA meetings and with board approval. That was another lie. Under state law, any homeowner had the right to review HOA financials within a reasonable time frame. They were hiding something. Determined, James went to the county records office and pulled Oak Ridge Estates' public financial filings. What he found made his jaw tighten. The HOA collected thousands in fees and fines every year. But according to the records, very little of that money was going toward actual neighborhood maintenance. Instead, a disproportionate amount was being paid out to a consulting firm, listed under an LLC, one that had Martha Kensington's name attached to it. James leaned back in his chair, a slow grin forming. Martha had set up a fake consulting company and was funneling HOA funds into her own pockets. James needed solid proof to build his case. He reached out to other homeowners who had suffered under the HOA's reign. At first, most were reluctant. They had seen what happened to those who fought back. But once James showed them the financial records, the fear turned into anger. A few homeowners, including Tom Monroe, finally stepped forward. "I've got old notices and emails from them," Tom said. "Fines for things that weren't even in the bylaws." Lisa, Tom's wife, nodded. "I also have something. Last year we paid a mandatory HOA renovation fee, but they never did anything. Now I know why." Piece by piece, James compiled a mountain of evidence: mismanaged funds, selective rule enforcement, outright fraud. The HOA had been extorting homeowners for years. And now, it was time to make them pay. James had everything he needed: proof of corruption, illegal fines, and fraudulent financial activity. Now, it was time to turn the tables. The next morning, he walked into his law office downtown, where his longtime friend and fellow attorney Michael Hayes was already waiting. "You're really doing this?" Michael asked, skimming the stack of documents James had compiled. James leaned back in his chair. "They gave me no choice. They've been extorting homeowners. For years, and I have enough evidence to bury them." Michael let out a low whistle as he flipped through the financial records. Fraud, embezzlement, selective enforcement. This isn't just a civil case. This could be criminal. James nodded. That's the plan. By midday, they had filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA for unlawful fines, financial mismanagement, and fraud. But James didn't stop there. He also submitted a complaint to the state's Department of Homeowner Associations and notified local media. If Martha and her board wanted a fight, they were about to get one. James had anticipated pushback, and Martha didn't disappoint. The very next morning, an emergency HOA notice was taped to his door. Due to ongoing legal actions against the HOA, you are hereby ordered to cease all non-compliant activities immediately. Further refusal to comply will result in immediate action, including but not limited to eviction proceedings. James smirked. They were bluffing. HOAs had power, but they couldn't evict homeowners on a whim. They had to go through legal channels, and given the evidence James had, the courts would never side with them. Later that day, as he pulled into his driveway, a black SUV was parked outside his house. Martha was waiting. She stepped out, flanked by 2 HOA board members, and smiled coldly. "James, I think we need to talk." James crossed his arms. "Unless you're here to resign, I doubt we have much to discuss." Martha's smile never wavered. "You're making a mistake. This lawsuit of yours, it's only going to make things harder for you." "For me? Or for you?" James shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, you and your board are looking at some serious criminal charges." For the first time, Martha's expression faltered, but she recovered quickly. "James, be reasonable. Lawsuits are expensive, stressful. You're a smart man. Wouldn't it be easier to just walk away?" James chuckled. "See, that's the difference between you and me, Martha. You think money and intimidation can make problems disappear. But I know the law, and the law isn't on your side." Martha left, but James knew she wasn't done. That night, more neighbors reached out, people who had been too afraid to speak before. Now that someone was standing up, they wanted in. By the end of the week, James had gathered a coalition of homeowners who were willing to testify. Michael grinned as they reviewed the witness list. "You've got them cornered. If they don't settle, this will go public." James nodded. "Good. I don't just want them to pay. I want the whole system to change." The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the HOA was the one on the defensive. And James? He was just getting started. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed in, taking their seats. James sat at the plaintiff's table, a calm but determined expression on his face. Across from him, Martha Kensington and 2 of her board members sat stiffly, their attorney flipping through a stack of documents with forced confidence. This was it, months of harassment, thousands in fraudulent fines, and years of HOA corruption, all led to this moment. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. The case of James Carter versus the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association was officially underway. Michael stood first, addressing the court. "Your Honor, this case is about more than just a few unfair fines. We have evidence that the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, led by Martha Kensington, has engaged in fraud, embezzlement, and illegal intimidation tactics against homeowners." Martha's attorney scoffed. "Your Honor, the HOA was merely enforcing its bylaws." Michael cut him off by placing a thick binder on the table with a satisfying thud. "This," he said, flipping it open, "is a detailed record of unlawful fines levied against homeowners, many of which violate state HOA regulations. Furthermore, we have financial records proving that thousands of dollars in HOA fees were funneled into a private company, one that just so happens to be owned by Mrs. Kensington herself." A ripple of whispers spread across the courtroom. Martha's face remained stoic, but her fingers clenched around the armrest of her chair. The judge leaned forward. "Is this true, Mr. Calloway?" he asked Martha's attorney. The man cleared his throat. "Your Honor, these claims are exaggerated." James stood, holding up another document. "This is a signed confession from the HOA's former treasurer, detailing exactly how the board mismanaged funds." The judge scanned the paper, then turned back to Martha. "Mrs. Kensington, do you have a response to this?" Martha finally spoke. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to tarnish my reputation. These so-called violations—" She was cut off by a sudden voice from the gallery. "I'd like to testify, Your Honor." The entire courtroom turned as Tom Monroe stood up. He looked nervous, but resolute. James smiled. He hadn't asked Tom to testify. He had volunteered. The judge nodded. "Approach the stand." Tom took a deep breath and walked to the witness chair. He was sworn in, then turned to face the room. "I was on the HOA board 3 years ago," he began, "and I quit when I realized what was happening. Martha and the board weren't just enforcing rules. They were targeting homeowners they didn't like." Martha's face went pale. They would ignore violations from people they were friends with, but fine others for minor things. They forced one man to sell his house by stacking up fake violations. And the money? It never went to fixing the neighborhood. It went into Martha's pocket. Gasps filled the room. James watched as Martha's lawyer quickly flipped through papers, trying to come up with a rebuttal. But there was nothing they could say now. The truth was out. The judge turned to Martha. "Mrs. Kensington, given the overwhelming evidence, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Carter. The fines imposed on him are nullified, and the HOA is ordered to return all improperly collected fees to affected homeowners." Martha opened her mouth to argue, but the judge wasn't done. "Additionally, I am recommending a full financial audit of the HOA's records. If evidence of fraud is confirmed, this case may escalate to criminal charges." Martha visibly deflated. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. James allowed himself a small smile. They had won. The reign of the corrupt HOA was finally over. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after the judge's final ruling. Then whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into hushed excitement. The homeowners who had been bullied for years now had justice. James sat back, his expression calm, but inside he felt the weight of pure satisfaction. It wasn't just about winning, it was about setting things right. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Martha Kensington and her remaining board members. "This court finds that the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, under Mrs. Kensington's leadership, engaged in improper financial activities, selective enforcement of rules, and illegal intimidation of homeowners," he stated firmly. Martha stiffened, her face drained of all color. "As a result, I am ordering the immediate removal of Mrs. Kensington and any complicit board members from their positions. Furthermore, all homeowners who were subjected to illegal fines or forced payments must be fully reimbursed." James watched as Martha's lawyer leaned over, whispering something urgently. It didn't matter. The damage was done. "And lastly," the judge continued, "based on the evidence of potential fraud and embezzlement, this case will be referred to the district attorney's office for further criminal investigation." A stunned silence fell over the room. Martha finally broke, her voice shaking. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The judge raised a hand. "I strongly advise you to remain silent, Mrs. Kensington." Her mouth snapped shut. James couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. For years, she had spoken down to homeowners, treating them like pawns in her own personal kingdom. Now, she was powerless. As soon as the verdict was final, homeowners began to speak up. Lisa Monroe, Tom's wife, turned to Martha. "You had us living in fear, paying fines for nonsense while you stole from us. I hope you rot in prison." Another neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Davidson, shook his head. I lost thousands because of you, Martha. I want every penny back." More voices joined in, angry, relieved, vindicated. The once feared HOA board was now the enemy of the very people they claimed to represent. Security escorted Martha and her board members out of the courthouse, past a crowd of furious homeowners. For the first time, she wasn't in control. She wasn't in charge. James exhaled, feeling the weight of victory settle in. Tom clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, man. You actually did it," James smirked. "No, we did. The corrupt HOA was finished, and Oak Ridge Estates would never be the same again." James stood at the edge of his driveway, breathing in the crisp evening air. The nightmare was over. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates felt like a true community. No more fear. No more ridiculous fines. No more corrupt leaders abusing their power. A week after the trial, the homeowners gathered at the community center to vote on the fate of the HOA. The decision was nearly unanimous. The HOA was officially dissolved. James had never seen so many relieved faces in one place. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out were now standing together. Lisa Monroe smiled as she raised her glass at the small celebration gathering. "To new beginnings, and to James for standing up when the rest of us were too scared." A round of applause followed. James just shook his head. "This was never just about me. We all fought for this." Back home, James pulled one last HOA violation notice from a drawer. With a smirk, he tore it in half and let the pieces fall. This was his home, and no one would ever take it from him again. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.